Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's eClaims webinar. We ask you to please keep your phone lines muted, as we will be using the chat feature to review your questions if time permits. Please enter your questions throughout the presentation in the chat box located on the right side of your screen. Use the drop-down to send your questions to the panelists. You can also hover over the WebEx tab at the top of your screen and click on Chat. If we run out of time to answer questions today, please email your questions to the eClaims 31 mailbox. We will answer as many of your questions as we can, but if we don't get to them, again, we ask that you send them to the eClaims 31 mailbox. We will also provide resources at the end of today's presentation for you. Today, we will be covering 3.1 news and 3.1 changelog updates. First, we will review eClaims recent news since the October webinar. You will find the updated 3.1 changelog on the 3.1 tables eClaims page on the board's website. The updates are summarized under item numbers 166 to 229 on the changelog. These changes include the 3.1 event table, the 3.1 element requirements table, and the 3.1 edit matrix. These changes will be reviewed during this webinar. Items number 230 through 235 were omitted from the changelog published on March 8th. Changes were made to the 3.1 element requirement table and the 3.1 edit matrix table. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation over to Mike Hunter for some updates and reminders.
Thank you, Patty. First reminder we wanted to give today was just a reminder regarding the new FROI-UR event that went into effect July 6, 2021. It was previously published back in January. This event now requires a FROI-UR on legacy cases for if there's a medical only and you have not filed a FROI-UR previously. The OOO or the FROI-OO is acceptable in lieu of the FROI-UR. For some reason, you prefer to file a FROI-OO. These are very important to get filed. This is to support both onboard and the formulary system, as well as to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information on that claim for the legacy cases. If you do not file that FROI-UR, as some of you may have experienced over the past few months, we can't always identify the proper TPA, and that could result in a decision being issued on a formulary request rather than it getting routed to your dashboard. We also wanted to give a reminder we had given earlier this year, late last year, regarding the FROI-AQ-AU. They are required if you are acquiring a claim. So it's very important that if a new third-party administrator is taking over, that the FROI-AQ or AU gets filed. Again, this is really what drives you being placed on notice in that case. So a lot of times we'll receive emails to our various board units asking from a TPA to be placed on notice. You have to file that FROI-AQ or AU in order to get placed on notice, and that gets you eCase access, as well as make sure that requests get routed to you, as well as board mail if something is going on with that case. And also in Release 3.1, this will also, when you file that FROI-AQ or AU, return that acquisition status code and let you know if a SHROI is due based on the previous third-party administrators' filings, if any. Now we're going to go over some of the changelog updates, as Patty had mentioned. These are for the changelog mostly from the July changelog. Next few I'm going to go over are going to have to do with the reduced benefit amount code of Z net to zero. That was pulled from our tables due to the IIBC change related to the new data element, that separate data element for net to zero. That will be implemented at a later date, and when we do so, we will make sure to publish our tables at least 6 months in advance according to the IA standards. So in this specific one here, we just removed the Z net to zero reduced benefit amount code from the element requirement table for the Schroy conditional requirement for DN 144. Current date disability began. That is the only change. In this one here, DN 192, benefit payment issue date. Again, the only change was just that we removed the Z net to zero reduced benefit amount code. And for this population restriction for maintenance type code, we removed the value Z net to zero for that population restriction. As you can see, other than that, nothing else changed on that population restriction. For this population restriction, we actually relaxed an edit to correspond with changelog number 54. And that population restriction on DN 288 was identified again in changelog item number 54. And we discovered through testing it was blocked by an edit on maintenance type code DN2. The edit on DN002 is being changed so that the Schroy CB transaction no longer requires at least 2 benefit types when that maintenance type code has a recovery code of 880. That was previously in one of the other population restrictions, and again, we just changed that because it was blocked by another population restriction. This again is just a change related to net to zero. So for this maintenance type code population restriction on DN002, we just remove value Z net to zero from reduced benefit amount code. And this one again, for DN002 maintenance type code, it was a population restriction, and the element error text was updated just to remove that Z net to zero for the reduced benefit amount code. This change was a population restriction change to DN0005, jurisdiction claim number. We actually relaxed an edit corresponding to changelog item number 63. And what we did was we removed the FROI 02 from the applicable report or MTC column for that population restriction, so it reads all except FROI 02. And what this now does is allows a change on the FROI 02 for the JCN in the case it was incorrectly submitted previously. Previously to this here, no change was allowed on any MTC. We're now allowing that on the FROI 02 to get back in sync with the correct JCN. The next set of edits, and for the population restrictions, they were removed, which resulted in relettering. So overall, we removed certain population restrictions and then relettered the other ones just to make sure they sequentially still showed properly. For this population restriction on DN 55, employee number of dependents, we removed the population restriction 55064B. As we discovered, it was actually duplicating another population restriction, the 64A and 64F. So we've now removed the A from the population restriction and the element error text, as it's now the only population restriction for DN 55 and error 64. So again, because we had an A and a B previously for that, we had A and B, and since we removed B, it now just reflects as a population restriction. We removed the lettering for this one. For DN 56, initial date disability began. Again, this was a population restriction related to just re-lettering due to the removal of a population restriction. During testing, we discovered that DN 56064E population restriction was duplicating 064D. So what we did was we removed E and re-lettered everything. So we've updated D as well to be applicable to all O2s and not just the FROI O2. And then we renumbered, re-lettered F to E, G to F, and H to G. So for the population restriction for DN 85, in this case here, we removed the population restriction for 064E. The population restriction was replaced in this instance by 0288064J. And what that does is it displays the error only once based on the number of benefits, rather than for every benefit segment. During testing, we had discovered that if we had the edit on benefit type code, it would actually give you, if you had 3 benefits, 3 of the same error. So rather than that, we changed it over to DN 288, and the error will display there now. And when we removed that, we had to re-letter everything from F to E, G to F, and H to G for DN 85. In the case of DN 85 and removing the and DN 216, other benefit type code of 300 must not be present. This condition was covered by another population restriction, and it was covered actually under a population restriction for other benefit type code, DN 0216-064B. And so because of that, and it was duplicating, we removed the population restriction related to benefit type code, and that resulted in just a re-lettering of F to E. For benefit credit code, the only change to this population restriction was related to removing the net to zero reference in this case. As you can see, the now at the bottom of the right side there is just net to zero is removed since that's no longer applicable. And for DN 134 and this population restriction, we just removed the population restriction G for 064 errors as it was duplicating 064E. So again, we just removed G, and no other changes have been made to the population restrictions for DN 134. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Mike. So continuing with the latest 3.1 changelog updates, originally added as changelog item 137, changelog item 198 removed this population restriction on 0197064B and 198064B. Full denial reason code, since these edits should be on the corresponding number of DNs, which you already have a population restriction in place to enforce this. And also, since only one population restriction currently remains for these, it was no longer necessary to have the label of A, so it was removed. Changelog item 200, remove the language for DN 400, cancel reason code is not D, duplicate or combined claim from the population restriction on the SHROI 02 is DN 400 will never be available on a SHROI. And you're going to hear a broken record here, but probably the next 10 or so slides, we're going to again reference changelog item 201, remove the reference of value Z net to zero from 202064D to support that IRR 914, as Mike said, which created a new DN for net to zero code to be implemented at a later date. And on the screen, you're just going to see how the new DN 202064 now reads without the net to zero in place. On to changelog item 202. Again, we removed 202064E since it was entirely dependent on net to zero, and removed any of the net to zero references on E and F. And then we had to alphabetically relabel them due to those changes. Changelog item 203, relax population restriction 202064H. That was also renumbered to 202064G to include unless recovery code equals 880, and then again remove the references to the net to zero. So on this slide, you're going to see how 202064G now reads based on those changes. Next, we have changelog item 206 for recovery 202064A, removing the reference net to zero again to support that IRR 914, and the new language for 202064A is shown on the slide and on the changelog. Changelog item 207 is another population restriction on recovery code. So DN 0226064B also removed any references of that net to zero. DN 283, number of payments. It's another instance of removing the references from net to zero from 283.045A is shown in this slide, and the element error text for that was also updated to read must be greater than zero since SHROI IP AP RB. Another instance on number of payments, DN 283.045B, we removed the references of net to zero and updated the element error text to reflect the change. Another one that was removed in its entirety as it was completely dependent on net to zero. Changelog item 215, we removed population restriction 0285.045 since it was completely dependent on net to zero, and we removed the 0545 error from DN 285 on the DN error message table. Changelog item 216, remove population restriction 0285064B on the SHROI 02 for reduced benefit amount code, since it had been determined that this population restriction is no longer necessary as reduced earnings cannot be updated on a SHROI 02. Changelog item 217, again, remove references to net to zero on the number of benefits, DN 0288045A. And by removing the reference to net to zero, 028064A now reads as shown on this slide. And the element error text now reads must be greater than zero unless DN 202 equals SND, because we removed the Z, or DN 0226 equals 880. Change log item 218, again, 288045B, also with references to net to zero, that had to be changed to remove those references and support that IRR 914. The current population restriction for 028804B now reads as shown on the slide above, and the element error text was updated to read must be greater than zero unless 202 equals SND or 226 equals 880, removing the Z. And now I'm going to turn it over to Patty.
We removed the previously published 3.1 population restriction as for DN 02888 number of benefits and replaced it with a new one. This corresponds with the change log item number 221. Agreement to comp code must be L without liability if claim type code is P. Indemnity with no lost time beyond waiting period if the only benefit type code accepted to date is 030, 090, 530, or 590. This population restriction replaces 0085064E, as it was determined it was preferable that the error would only appear once for the given transaction rather than for every single benefit segment. The error message text will remain the same, along with the data element missing in change variable segment. We removed the population restriction 0404064B for initial return to work physical restrictions indicator, as the presence of an initial return to work date does not necessarily guarantee the presence of current return to work date. We removed population restriction 04064B. In population restriction 0406-064B for latest return to work type code, we removed the reference to net to zero, as Kim and Mike both previously stated. This coincides with change log item number 226. We removed the reference to reduced benefit amount code value Z net to zero to support IRR 914. The same applies to this population restriction for latest return to work physical restriction code. We removed the net to zero reference. In population restriction 0408-064B for latest return to work with the same employer, we again removed the reference to net to zero. This coincides with change log item 228. This was also done to support IRR 914. And again, this will be implemented later on, and we will announce it when that time comes. We added a new population restriction for DN 0422, part of body, injured fingers, toes, location code. This coincides with change log item number 229. This change was to facilitate the O2 change transactions and protect data integrity. So, for example, ring finger for fingers other than thumb should not be listed more than once in the transaction. And to simplify that, you should use bilateral ring fingers rather than right and left ring fingers. Before we conclude today's presentation, I want to make sure you're aware of the methods to stay informed on eClaims news and upcoming engagement opportunities. You can visit the eClaims website at WCB to stay up to date on news on eClaims news. You can also sign up to receive news straight to your inbox. This is how we will be communicating future engagement opportunities throughout the course of the BIS project. Visit the eClaims site and select WCB notifications within the eClaims overview section. Questions, comments, and feedback on the eClaims EDI 3.1 upgrade can be emailed to eClaims31@WCBNewYork.gov. Questions regarding existing eClaims EDI 3.0 should continue to be sent to eClaims@wcb.ny.gov. You can also follow the board on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. A recording of this webinar is going to be placed on our YouTube and eClaims website, as well as FAQ spawned from the questions being asked during this webinar series. So keep an eye out for these resources, as well as a follow-up email and survey. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time today.